Nothing is ever certain, my mother said, clinging to it as he hoped she might. My mother had been the one who knew the meaning of each charm on my bracelet, where we had gotten it and why I liked it. She made a meticulous list of what I'd carried and worn. If found miles away and in isolation along a road, these clues might lead a policeman there to link it to my death. In my mind I had wavered between the bittersweet joy of seeing my mother name all the things I carried and loved, and her futile hope that these things mattered. That a stranger who found a cartoon character eraser or a rock star button would report it to the police. After Len's phone call, my father reached out his hand and the two of them sat in the bed together, staring straight in front of them. My mother numbly clinging to this list of things, my father feeling as if he were entering a dark tunnel. At the same point, it began to rain. I could feel them both thinking the same thing then, but neither of them said it. That I was out there somewhere, in the rain, that they hoped that I was safe, that I was dry somewhere, and warm. Neither of them knew who fell asleep first, their bones aching with exhaustion. They drifted off and woke guiltily at the same time. The rain, which had changed several times as the temperature dropped, was now hail, and the sound of it, of small stones of ice hitting the roof above them, woke them together. They did not speak. They looked at each other in the small light cast from the lamps left on across the room. My mother began to cry, and my father held her, wiped her tears with the pad of his thumbs as they crested her cheekbones, and kissed her very gently on the eyes. I looked away from them then, as they touched. I moved my eyes into the cornfield, seeing if there was anything that in the morning the police might find. The hail bent the stalks and drove all the animals into their holes, not so deep beneath the earth where the warrens of the wild rabbits I loved, the bunnies that ate the vegetables and flowers in the neighbourhood nearby and that sometimes, unwittingly, brought poison home to their dens. Then, inside the earth, and so far away from the man or woman who had laced a garden with toxic bait, an entire family of rabbits would curl into themselves and die. On the morning of the 10th, my father poured the scotch down the kitchen sink. Lindsay asked him why. "I'm afraid I might drink it," he said. "What was the phone call?" my sister asked. "What phone call?" "I heard you say that thing you always say about Susie's smile, about stars exploding." "Did I say that?" "You got kind of goofy. It was a cop, wasn't it?" "No lies?" "No lies," Lindsay agreed. "They found a body part. It might be Susie's. It was a hard sock in the stomach." "What?" "Nothing is ever certain," my father tried. Lindsay sat down at the kitchen table. "I'm going to be sick," she said. "Honey?" "Dad, I want you to tell me what it was, which body part, and then I'm going to need to throw up." My father got down a large metal mixing bowl. He brought it to the table and placed it near Lindsay before sitting down. "Okay," she said. "Tell me." It was an elbow. The Gilbert's dog found it. He held her hand and then she threw up, as she had promised, into the shiny silver bowl. Later that morning the weather cleared, and not too far from my house the police ripped off the cornfield and began their search. The rain, sleet, snow and hail melting and mixing had left the ground sodden. Still, there was an obvious area where the earth had been freshly manipulated. They began there and dug. In places, the lab found later, there was a dense concentration of my blood mixed with the dirt, but at the time the police grew more and more frustrated, plying the cold wet ground and looking for Girl. Along the border of the soccer field, a few of my neighbours kept a respectful distance from the police tape, wondering at the men dressed in heavy blue parkas wielding shovels and rakes like medical tools. My father and mother remained at home. Lindsay stayed in her room. Buckley was nearby at his friend Nate's house, where he spent a lot of time these days. They had told him I was on an extended sleepover at Clarissa's. I knew where my body was, but I could not tell them. I watched and waited to see what they would see, and then, like a thunderbolt late in the afternoon, a policeman held up his earth-caked fist and shouted, "Over here!" he said, and the other officers ran to surround him. The neighbours had gone home, except for Mrs. Steed. After conferring around the discovering policeman, Detective Fenneman broke their dark huddle and approached her. "Mrs. Steed?" he said over the tape that separated them. "Yes." "You have a child in the school?" "Yes." "Could you come with me, please?" A young officer led Mrs. Steed under the police tape and over the bumpy, churned-up cornfield to where the rest of the men stood. "Mrs. Steed," Len Fenneman said, "does this look familiar?" He held up a paperback copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. "Do they read this at the school?" "Yes," she said, her face draining of colour as she said the small word. "Do you mind if I ask you—" he began. "Ninth grade," she said, looking into Len Fenneman's slate blue eyes. "Susie's grade." She was a therapist and relied on her ability to hear bad news and discuss rationally the difficult details of her patients' lives, but she found herself leaning into the young policeman who had led her over. I could feel her wishing that she had gone home when the other neighbours had left, wishing that she was in the living room with her husband or out in the backyard with her son. "Who teaches the class?" "Mrs. Jewett," Mrs. Steed said. "The kids find it a real relief after Othello." "Othello?" "Yes," she said, her knowledge of the school suddenly very important right now. All the policemen listening. "Mrs. Jewett likes to modulate her reading list, and she does a big push right before Christmas with Shakespeare. Then she passes out Harper Lee as a reward. If Susie was carrying around To Kill a Mockingbird, it means she must have turned in her paper on Othello already." All of this checked out. The police made calls. I watched the circle widen. Mrs. Jewett had my paper. Eventually, she sent it back to my parents, unmarked, through the mail. "Thought you might want to have this," Mrs. Jewett had written on a note attached to it. "I'm so very, very sorry." Lindsay inherited the paper because it was too painful for my mother to read. The Ostracized, One Man Alone, I had called it. Lindsay had suggested The Ostracized, and I made up the other half. My sister punched 3 holes down the side of it and fastened each carefully handwritten page into an empty notebook. She put it in her closet under her Barbie case in the box that held her perfect condition Raggedy Ann and Andy that I'd envied. Detective Fenneman called my parents. They had found a schoolbook, they believe, that might have been given to me that last day. "But it could be anyone's," my father said to my mother as they began another restless vigil. "Or she could have dropped it along the way." Evidence was mounting, but they refused to believe. 2 days later, on December 12th, the police found my notes from Mr. Bott's class. Animals had carried off the notebook from its original burial site. The dirt did not match the surrounding samples, but the graph paper, with its scribbled theories that I could never understand, but still dutifully recorded, had been found when a cat knocked down a crow's nest. Shreds of the paper were laced among the leaves and twigs. The police unbraided the graph paper, along with strips of another kind of paper, thinner and brittle, that had no lines. The girl who lived in the house where the tree stood recognized some of the handwriting. It was not my writing, but the writing of the boy who had a crush on me. Ray Singh. On his mother's special rice paper, Ray had written me a love note, which I never read. He had tucked it into my notebook during our Wednesday lab. His hand was distinct. When the officers came, they had to piece together the scraps of the biology notebook and of Ray Singh's love note. "Ray is not feeling well," his mother said when the detective called his house and asked to speak to him, but they found out what they needed from her. Ray nodded to her as she repeated the policeman's questions to her son. Yes, he had written Susie Salmon a love note.